Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Natalie Defengi, and I'm the Associate Director of the BraceWater Center. So I'd like to welcome everyone today to today's Water Talk titled Safeguarding the Provision of Drinking Water in a Changing Climate. Before we begin, on behalf of Brace, I would like to acknowledge that McGill University is on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. So a quick housekeeping note for the audience. I just wanted to let you know online that we do have about 20 people right now online, and just to let you know that there will be time for questions at the end. So you can enter your questions in the chat, and then we'll address those questions at the end. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Monica Emelko, a professor and Canada Research Chair in Water Science, Technology and Policy at the University of Waterloo, where she's also the Associate Director of Climate Risk, Resilience and Adaptation at the Waterloo Climate Institute. So Monica's research is focused on drinking water treatment and risk analysis for public health protection, and has informed water regulations globally, including the US surface water treatment rules and their international equivalents. Monica is the scientific director of the forWater and Cirque Strategic Network for Forested Drinking Water Source Protection Technologies. This is a Canada-wide and internationally partnered research network of academics, water utilities, government agencies, industrial forest companies, and organizations focused on forest management-based approaches for drinking water source protection. So with that, I'm going to give Monica the floor for her seminar, and we'll have questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here in Montreal today at McGill University. This place holds a special place in my heart. I'm very happy to see friends I haven't seen in a while. It's so good to see people in person. And I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to talk about something that's really near and dear to my heart. So the issue of drinking water protection in a changing climate. So in getting started, I always like to kind of provide a perspective on the lens that I come from, because I like to say I have a checkered past, but that doesn't usually sound right. So I'll say I have a diverse past. And it's really been a rather transformative experience for me. And I just, of course, lost my mouse and ability to advance. So I'm just going to give it a go. But yeah, I've had a really interesting pathway. Maybe I can do it this way. There we go, that'll go. And the way I tend to describe myself these days is that I'm an engineer that is really focused and interested in public health. And that's important because it's the lens through which I talk about a lot of these issues. And I'll talk a little bit about my checkered past in a moment. But water supply and treatment is important. The COVID-19 pandemic certainly has reminded us of that. And it's because of the importance of basic hygiene and sanitation. These are data from the New England Journal of Medicine showing causes of death in the 1900s and 2010, and you can see a 3,000+% drop in infectious diseases over that time period, and that's because of basic hygiene and sanitation. So water supply and treatment is important. 4 of the major causes of death changed as a result of water and wastewater treatment. What we do is important. It's not maybe a health issue, it is a health issue. If you don't have access to clean water, you can count the days until people get sick and potentially have even more severe consequences than that, including death. This is US infectious disease crude death rates, similarly showing the impact, as you can see up here, with the first continuous municipal use of chlorine in water. Very analogous in Canada, very analogous in other parts of the world, where we saw death rates drop again because of decreases in the spread of infectious disease. So for me, this is why I wanted to go into engineering, environmental engineering, and specifically the area of water, because it matters. You can literally change people's lives. And so how do we integrate health and water? And then what are the barriers and challenges posed by changing climate? So I love this because this is clearly a dated image. It's back to 1996, but even though it's an older image, it's still quite valid. And what it talks about is how we actually approach this issue of safe drinking water, regardless of the jurisdiction you're in. So this is EPA from 1996 in the United States. This is down here in the bottom. It's the Canadian same representation of the multi-barrier approach to safe drinking water. And then over to the right, I've got World Health Organization. But the bottom line here is not the differences, but rather the similarities. It's this notion that there's a multi-barrier approach to the protection of public health through the provision of safe drinking water. And this is how largely these issues are approached globally. This idea that we have sources of water that we must protect. We then have treatment. We have distribution, especially in Canada. That's a big issue because there's so many kilometers of distribution system piping that we have to manage. And then there's testing to make sure we're in fact delivering what we say we're delivering. And then there's the last piece is drinking water. But the reason why that last piece is important is because it represents human perceptions, community perceptions on what is safe, what is appropriate. Because not all communities have the same values, preferences, tastes, perspectives on what's appropriate. So it's important to remember that at the end of the day, the final judge is actually the consumer. And so it has been argued historically that source water protection is the most important barrier. And every year upon year, we see that that is also the one that we are the weakest in. How do you protect sources? The whole idea behind this historically has worked really well. Don't contaminate, right? Controls on urbanization, industrial polluters, development, et cetera. And that works really, really well in an urbanized environment. The problem is Mother Nature doesn't care about those regulations. Mother Nature can send a fire, a flood, compound disturbances, fires after floods, after hurricanes, et cetera. And those source water protection attitudes don't matter. And in a changing climate, these issues become really important. So why in a changing climate? This is a great paper for any students. It came out of the USGS. It's by Milley et al., 2008 from Science, and it's Stationarity is Dead, Weather Water Management. And this concept is critical to understanding why climate change is such an issue for water management. It's not an issue of there's drought. That is not how climate change works. It's not like we lost water somewhere. It's just now moving around to different places and at different times where we're not accustomed to it being. Perhaps where communities have not developed and evolved in the same way. And so the whole issue with changing climate is this idea of stationarity and in fact non-stationarity. So the whole idea there is we can't predict the future, can't even predict what's going to happen in the near future, in the present, based on the past. So this idea that water quality, which drives treatment, fluctuates within a certain range or an envelope, is gone. We used to say, okay, there's a range and we'll design a plant for 30, 40 years out. But this idea of non-stationarity, some people think, oh, okay, well, maybe water quality is deteriorating and so some parameter I want to measure is increasing. That would be easy to deal with. If it was a step function like the upper right corner, it would also be easy to deal with. We had a baseline, now it's shifted. It might be expensive, but from an engineering design perspective, it would be easy. This one down here is a little bit harder with increased variance because now we need to be more resilient. We need to be able to respond to a wider range. But that's not really typically what we see with non-stationarity either. What we typically see, and again, it's kind of ironic to say typically about non-stationarity. So perhaps I'll remove that word and say what we're seeing is that we don't know. We don't know what to expect because we're seeing things we haven't seen before. That's non-stationarity. And so how do you know how to prepare for something if you don't know what you're going to get? And so in thinking about that, what do applied scientists and engineers do? We start to think about, okay, well, what might the worst case scenarios be? And in Canada, in the United States, in South Africa, in Australia, in Brazil, in many parts of the world, whether people realize it or not, the majority, not all, but the majority of our water supplies originate on forested landscapes. And you don't have to live in the forested landscape to have your water originate in the forested landscape. And so one of the big issues and opportunities in the drinking water treatment engineering world is the broader connection and important recognition of hydrology, which we don't normally talk about. We normally regulate everything in concentrations. We don't talk about very frequently, unless we're looking to fill a reservoir, we don't talk about what are the relationships between stream flows or discharges and rain events, intensity, frequency, duration. That's not typically integrated into people's thinking when they think about how do I design a water treatment plant or how do I operate a water treatment plant. And so in our landscapes where we have to think about forests. And ironically, forests are amongst the landscapes that there are no source protection policies applied to them. They're multi-jurisdictional, they cross into different communities, and nobody owns them per se. We have groundwater protection plans, but we don't have protection of any sort of the landscapes where the majority of our water originates. And the thing with changing climate is that there are natural disturbances, quote unquote natural disturbances, that are exacerbated by it. Climate change exacerbated landscape disturbance effects on water are critical. And they connect to issues of drought, but they also connect to issues of treatment capabilities. And it's really not, do we have the technology to treat water? Because we can treat any water. We can treat water on the space station. The question is, how much are you going to pay for it? And can you instantly do it and supply enough to the community? We can treat water. We're really good at it. But can we do it on demand in sufficient quantity? And so warming climate means more disturbances of all types. It affects water quantity and quality. And as IPCC recently emphasized in 2022, it's not just about these disturbances, it's about the fact that they're compounded and they have cascading effects. So it's not just that I have extreme precipitation, it's that perhaps I'm in Alberta, in the Rockies, and it's been really dry because of increasing temperatures. But then in the spring, we get these crazy spring, greater extreme precipitation, and so now the vegetation grows. And then we have a dry summer and the vegetation dries. And because the vegetation's drying and it's so hot and we haven't had rain, we now have conditions set up for fires, so now we have more fuel for the fires. And then when the next rains come after the fires come, then they mobilize that material from the landscape and deliver it to not only the receiving streams in the headwaters, but then that's transported over time downstream and has a legacy, long-term effects in some places, but not others. Those are the legacies of changing climate that we need to think about and we need to try to prepare for in thinking about these worst-case scenarios. And our basis that we need to deal with in terms of recognizing issues related to water is source matters. This is a plot of cost per million gallons of treatment per percentage of watershed forested. And it's not a great fit, it's not supposed to be, but in general, if you squint your eyes, you can see that up until a point, if you have a healthy forest, you have healthy water, meaning high quality source water. I always like to point out the upper 2 points because the upper 2 points are forests that are actually not so healthy. And so not doing as good of a job, so to speak, in pre-treating water as we might see in a healthier forest. So just because we have a forest, that was good, doesn't mean it's healthy. Okay, so where was I? I was in forests. And so this whole idea of compound disturbance, and not all forests are necessarily the healthiest forests. And that brings us to that drinking water security is significantly threatened in many regions globally. It's not just an issue of drought. It's not do we have the technology. It's that we need more resilience because we're experiencing these fluctuations. Okay, so I've thrown up a term, and that's frustrating because I assume everybody knows what I mean by drinking water security, but I want to make sure we're on the same path. Because we hear a lot about this concept of water security. UNESCO has a definition of water security. And my point when I talk about drinking water security is, I think about the ability to treat water and do it cost effectively so we can distribute it to communities. And what that means is it's not just about is the source contaminated, it's about how hard is it to treat. So while ecosystem health overlaps with human health from a distribution of water perspective, for sure, just because it's good for the ecosystem does not mean it's good for drinking water treatment. And oftentimes you'll see the biggest challenges are not from contaminants of health concern. They're actually from things like organic carbon. And so let's talk about that a bit. So we're talking about treatability. And so when you think of a conventional treatment plant for surface water, we have a lot of infrastructure. And the net idea behind this is we have mixing, we add chemicals to aggregate solids, We flocculate them, we remove them typically by a sedimentation process because it's relatively inexpensive. We settle out these solids. With them come a lot of solid-associated contaminants like metals. You can always tell who's not a drinking water treatment person because they'll go, ooh, that water supply has metals in it. And drinking water treatment people are like, yes, and? Metals are not hard to treat. Carbon's hard to treat. Carbon, in fact, often dominates the coagulant demand here, not turbidity, not solids. And carbon character can change because what is carbon? There are so many different types of natural organic matter in systems. After these processes, we have a polishing step for solids. We remove some pathogens, but then we get to the point that I started with at the talk, which is disinfection. Let's get rid of those acute risks to human health. So we have to do all this work to get rid of those risks. And then if we have trace organics, so man-made organics typically, from urbanized landscapes, then we typically will see either an advanced oxidation process or an adsorption process to manage them, plus minus. So more infrastructure. Often in the case of groundwater, if it's a high-quality supply, we can bypass all of this and go straight to disinfection because all water supplies require disinfection. And so what's startling is in the case of treatment and treatability, we're actually in a situation in which very few parameters really, really drive how well treatment processes work. And there's different variations. That was a conventional scheme, but those are the basic mechanisms that we're taking advantage of. Solids, measured by turbidity because we can measure them in real time. Color and total organic carbon or dissolved organic carbon, they're interrelated and they have to do with the typically natural organic matter, but not exclusively. You can also have synthetic organic matter present in the supply. That's how we design water treatment plants. And then if there are any trace organics that require unique treatment processes, we could add them. But these are the main drivers of treatment. These are not compounds of health concern, but these are the compounds that when we have landscape disturbances can really throw treatment off. And really the problematic one is organic carbon, because it is one of the key factors that affects charge of particles in water supplies. There's no such thing as the composition of organic carbon because it's a complicated cocktail of different compounds that can change. It can be dynamic on the landscape. It can be transformed on the landscape. It can be a precursor to disinfection byproducts. It can lead to distribution system instability. That's why these parameters matter. And so it might be fine and well if I don't have quote unquote contaminants of health concern after disturbance, but these contaminants can shut a plant down if they're fluctuating too much because of the operational response required. So almost all target compounds can be treated by currently available technologies. It doesn't mean we don't need new technologies, but what we need is more resilient technologies, more cost-effective technologies, more efficient technologies. And we need to think about how resilient are these various technologies to water quality fluctuations. That's what we need for changing climate. So this notion of build the next technology, a lot of the new technologies like membrane technologies, the way they work, people love them because they're great for smaller communities because they have a lot of automation. But when something goes wrong, how long are you willing to go without water? Whereas these other technologies that I've got here, they're more forgiving. They require operational control, but they're more forgiving and therefore can often power through some of these more extreme disturbances. So it's a tough position to be in because in some communities, the rural, the remote, the marginalized communities, we don't have the resources to get the supplies needed to have the operational capacity to run the technology. And then when you throw on top of that disturbances that really can result in shifts in runoff, erosion processes and runoff and then delivery of materials that can make treatment fluctuate, it becomes challenging. And I didn't ever used to think about this. I always thought I'm a treatment engineer and we treat things that come out of pipes. You name it, we can treat it, we'll build a reactor. But back in 2003, I got invited to Alberta, to the south part of Alberta, to the Crow's Nest Pass. There had been a fire in 2003, and I thought, well, this will be kind of different. It'll be interesting to study. We should care about this. For years, we tried to get money to study it, and we were always told, oh, this is a one-off issue. This isn't a big deal. And I thought, okay, well, study this, and that'll be that. We'll look at the implications to drinking water treatment. Maybe we'll find some pHs. But the thing is, the fires just kept happening. And they're happening all over the world. And what we see is when we see these fluctuations in water quality, we actually see that fire is amongst the hardest of the disturbances on water. That's why people here should care about fire, right? Because if you can be resilient to fire, you can be resilient to most other natural disturbances in your treatment process, whether it be a flood or a hurricane followed by a flood, drought conditions that lead to then a series of vegetation growth and then disturbance of that vegetation and downstream delivery of nutrients. And when you have these types of disturbances, what you very quickly start to see is that not every fire or not every flood will have any impact, right? They all start as small disturbances, but some can have quite significant disturbances and they can last for a long time. So these are some shots from southern Alberta prior to fire and then after fire in our headwater streams. And of course, then one of the biggest challenges that you see is how do those effects propagate downstream? And we get back to the standard or classic challenge of cumulative watershed effects assessment, where how far down is this going to propagate? How long is it going to last? And how does it compare to the other inputs, the tributaries into my river, for example? This is from Waterton Lakes National Park. It was beautiful and clear, and then this pulse of wildfire ash came through. And I have it here to remind us that people have this image that if you have a disturbance, it just has to flush through, and then everything will be fine. So this is an example of sediment and turbidity in the Crow's Nest Pass after the fire starting in 2004. So I've got sediment for the landscape scientists, turbidity for the treatment people, because when treatment people look at TSS, they don't really know what to do, right? Because we need real-time data. These are just annual averages, but they get the story across. So we've got green as the reference catchments, several unburned catchments that were up in this map here. So we had 7 study catchments, and then another 2 were added later on in southwestern Alberta. Black is burned, and then orange is post-fire salvage logged. And you can see what the landscape looks like up there in the right. It's clearly material's going to be coming off the landscape. Sometimes you can actually get a hydrophobic surface form, and everything just washes off, but that didn't happen during this fire. And this shows a classic story where most post-disturbance studies at the watershed scale, they're extremely expensive. We're talking about large areas of study. 3 years, 4 years of studying. What you see here is, okay, we saw an effect of the disturbance, and most people would say, okay, it's flushing through. You're getting back to normal. And then, of course, your hydrologist colleagues will say, well, what about hydroclimatic variability? And there's, of course, wet years and dry years. Those were the dry years. Once the wet years came back, so did this delivery of materials. And not surprisingly, solids, they sit in our gravel bed rivers. They're ingressed into the river. And then the energy, when the storms come, lifts them right up, transports them downstream. Some of the fine colloidal material stays in the water column. But so in these systems, we still haven't seen recovery of solids. We see greater peaks and extremes. And with those solids come nutrients like phosphorus. The major vector for phosphorus transport is fine colloidal solids, especially if they're rich in iron and manganese. And sure enough, we have a fair amount of phosphorus in these systems, and sure enough, we see algae proliferation and if the food is there for the primary productivity, you see the benthic invertebrates growing, the fish get bigger. Not necessarily happier, it depends on which fish you are interested in. And other nutrients like total nitrogen, for example, do recover after a few years' time. But this gets to a really interesting point. When I would talk to my ecologist and hydrologist friends, they'd say, oh, look, rapid recovery in 4 years. And to a drinking water treatment engineer, rapid recovery is 4 hours, not 4 years. And again, these are annual averages, so some of the values could actually be quite higher in R. And what we see is when we see these spikes, this is now in carbon concentration that drives so many issues in treatment, we see that they're during the higher energy events. And because we're talking about carbon, we also see shifts in the type of carbon. So what we tend to see is shifts in, this is carbon fractionation with size exclusion chromatography. What we tend to see is shifts in humic substances in particular and building blocks, the more aromatic compounds that exert coagulant demand and lead to disinfection byproduct formation potential in these systems. So it's not just that there's more carbon, it's what kind of carbon is there, and you don't always see it if you're not sampling at the right times. And the times that you have to be out and sampling are during the events. He's tied off, by the way, in case anybody's wondering. But we also have ISCO samplers, so automated samplers to capture samples as well. And here again, you see the same issue with sediments now in some of these disturbed catchments. And how this then leads to that more variable water quality is really, really fascinating. So we start to get into now as we move downstream, and we have these materials, these nutrient-rich materials. What's happening is, in a very simple description, because we have a history of glaciation, because we have these fine colloidal sediments that carry nutrients, they become available and they get mobilized. They become mobilized. In other landscapes, you won't see this, so I don't want to imply that what I'm saying is true everywhere. That's one of the challenges, is these regional effects and differences. But in our catchments here, this is most certainly what we saw. And so you say, okay, I've got my undisturbed river. Now I have a post-fire disturbance. I've got some of these fine colloidal sediments, less than about 63 microns in size, that are deposited, very easily resuspended. Some of them get ingressed more into the riverbed. But over time, they release the limiting nutrient, phosphorus. And of course, it's not as simple as if you have phosphorus, you're going to have algae proliferation and primary productivity. But it doesn't help. So you see changes in these systems. And what we end up seeing is post-fire stabilization with biofilm, biostabilization of these riverbeds. And you go, oh, wasn't that a good thing? So if we look at different consolidation periods of these materials before the energy is then introduced in the system, this was done at Canada's Centre for Inland Waters in Burlington, Ontario, at the largest annular flume in the world. We looked at different consolidation periods and the impacts of these solids. And what we saw, sure enough, is that the energy required, the critical shear stress for erosion, was much higher when we had these burned solids in the system, and it was because of biostabilization. But when the energy comes, look how much more material is eroded. So it's like ripping that biofilm off and just taking all these materials downstream. That's where our flashier water comes from in these systems. This material sits there, and it sits for years, and it can make its way far, far downstream. And you don't always see the impacts right away because these ecosystems take a while to develop. And the conditions have to be right? And there's cumulative effects. So increasingly variable source water quality is not because there's a flush through the system only. It's because we're setting ourselves down a different ecological pathway that can lead to greater variability over the longer term. And if we don't monitor it, we won't see it. That's what climate change is doing to water supplies. And it becomes a really interesting discussion of how do I study these parameters that drive treatment. It's fascinating to me in talking with some fantastic colleagues here at McGill today about why is it that we talk about sediments and we talk about pathogens as particles, but carbon, which is arguably a nanoparticle, we treat as a solute all the time. Doesn't that confound how we think about its transport? And then also degradation and its movement through various environments. It becomes challenging because these are the parameters. They might not be exciting. They might not be PFAS. They might not be microplastics. But these are the parameters that are going to prevent water treatment plants from working well and providing adequate amounts of safe water. The one thing that I don't have represented on here that I have to add, and I have to figure out how best to add it, of course, is the availability of key nutrients like phosphorus and associated micronutrients like iron that lead to the proliferation of algae and more specifically cyanobacteria that can clog our plants and lead to not only those types of supply issues, but also potentially form toxins. So drinking water treatability has to be considered if we're going to have resilience in a changing climate. It's not just about having the right technology. More variable, less predictable source water is really a game changer. And people think, oh, well, if you're in Alberta, in Calgary, or in Banff, high quality systems have the most to lose, and that is true. But it's not just the high quality systems. We also studied fire up in Fort McMurray, The river that I often describe to people as looking like chocolate milk in the spring, and then the tributaries look like hot fudge sauce coming into the system. It's an already challenged system. This is a 100,000 square kilometer watershed approximately, in which only 5 to 6% of the watershed burned. And a lot of people thought, you can see some of, this was when we were doing an aerial survey before reentry to look at the water supply to see if it was in sufficient condition to have people move back into the community after the Horse River wildfire in 2016. And a different landscape than the one we were looking at previously. It's flat up top. And so the river's incised, and the surface, the river connectivity is very different. Things ooze off this landscape into this river. But they definitely make it their way into the river. It's hydrologically connected, except when it's not. It's one of the more complicated hydrologies in Canada. But people said, you know what, this is a deteriorated system. This is the tar sands. We're not going to see an impact of the fire. But sure enough, we did. Fortunately, the fire happened upstream of the water treatment plant. This is the community. Here's the water treatment plant with the raw water storage clarifiers. Fire happened kind of upstream here, and the river flows this way to the north. So we didn't have to deal with the challenge of the contaminants from the built environment, but the carbon was challenging enough. And you can see this is just 2 kilometers upstream of the water treatment plant intake, and you can see the hot fudge sauce oozing into the river, the nutrient-rich, the carbon-rich water. And what we saw in Fort McMurray, I have to finish this data set. This is UV absorbance at 254 nanometers, which still remains, after extensive carbon characterization, this still remains one of the most useful tools. What we see is that, sure enough, because we have high resolution data, we were able to do some bootstrapping. Green is untreated raw water, blue is treated water. And this plot shows us clearly, in combination with the bootstrapping, that prior to the fire, here we are with UV 254, that tells us about carbon concentration and aromaticity. After the fire, the baselines come up. It's more flashy, it's more variable, very clearly. And it continues on to this day. The blue line shows that treatment capacity is doing pretty well. So they're responding well. But what also came with those solids and that carbon that they have responded well to is nutrients that have made their way into the clarifiers that have resulted in algae blooms every year since 2016. That plant was built in the 80s. They never had an algal bloom. Every year we've had them. They're aphanizomenon. As you can see, this is us collecting sediment, my colleague Mike Stone from geography. And what's interesting and notable about these blooms is this isn't like the Toledo bloom where the whole surface of Lake Erie or the surface of the water looked covered in green. These blooms are deeper. You can't see them, and if you don't go looking for them, you don't necessarily know that they're there until you look in your water treatment plant and see that it's filled with these little aphanizomenon cyanobacteria. No regulations, no guidance on what to do. Recognizing that aphanizomenon has the potential to form different toxins, only microcystins are regulated. What Fort McMurray is faced with, I won't go through all the treatment technologies, but they're faced with the potential for advanced oxidation, which means ozone, which the long and the short for that system of 60,000 people means at least $60 million of investment in infrastructure, and that doesn't include operations and maintenance costs associated with generation of ozone. So that's currently what we're investigating, but we don't even know if that'll work as effectively because ozone is challenged in systems with high levels of carbon. So we're pulling out all of the biggest and best treatment technologies in the hope that we'll be able to manage risk accordingly. But we're in the domain of what's not regulated. And this isn't something that's going to go away. And while I've been talking about wildfire impacts on water quality and treatability, don't for a second think that this is only limited to issues of wildfire. There's a fantastic paper in ES&T by Stoddard and colleagues that talks about continental scale increases in lakes, streams, and we're seeing eutrophication. So more nutrients going from oligotrophic streams and lakes to eutrophied streams. And the question is why? There's no development in these systems. Really, really nice study. And the long and the short is really what's left in terms of realities in these systems is increased precipitation, erosion, runoff, nutrient availability, and the start of the cascading effects with eutrophication. What's also really interesting, I'll go back to Fort McMurray, is that these systems are dynamic. It's not like fire will do this or flooding can do this. When these organisms start to grow, we start to see the reservoirs change. We start to see more macrophytes, emergent and submergent macrophytes developing in these systems, signs that there are plenty of nutrients present. And what we start to see then is a change in the system, and what we believe is happening is that these communities now have the ability to not only uptake these nutrients like phosphorus, but also transform the carbon in the system, leading to more aromatic carbon, more coagulant demand, more disinfection byproduct formation potential because of the dynamics of the system. So they're not static, which means we have to keep looking because the system's changing annually. It's changing through the season, and it's changing annually. So this then gets us to, well, what can we do? Some people have suggested nature-based solutions. We've talked about green technologies. For what it's worth, I want to throw out to any engineers interested in nature-based solutions that we really need to think about what makes a technology green. Does nature-based mean natural resource-based? Does it mean anything microbial because microorganisms work for free? What about lower energy or lower waste production, lower footprint? Are those types of technologies green? And what do we give up when we go with green technology? Typically, this is a paper one of our grad students, master student wrote that was in blue-green systems. And one of the great points that Emma made was that these technologies have so much less control to offer. So how can we assure people that if we're going to go with these technologies that they're going to get what they were looking for? But there is hope. Emma did some subsequent work looking at biological filtration processes, so the idea that the organisms can utilize some of the carbon so that it can't wreak its havoc. And she did a series of column tests looking at establishing microbial communities and then adding different levels of wildfire ash impacted water to the system. And the long and short was, if you look at DOC removal in these different systems with different levels of wildfire ash, so a control and then increasingly more ash as we go left to right from top to bottom, what we saw was that sure enough, these systems had an ability to respond and perform at the same level as the control. But they weren't perfect. And part of the reason why is because not all of these fractions of carbon are biodegradable. So we were really able to deal with low molecular weight neutrals and acids. This is now carbon concentration in the influent in blue, and then the effluents. And you can see in looking at this that we were able to manage some of the DOC spikes, but they weren't the spikes in humic substances. They were the spikes in the biodegradable fractions. So depending on what type of disturbance you have and what type of carbon is released and how that's transformed in your reservoir or not, or in your lake or not, that resilience is not guaranteed. And so this takes us to other source water protection approaches, and I'll wrap up shortly, but I want to talk about other landscape management approaches. So I talked about traditional source water protection that involves don't contaminate. But again, these fences don't work very well with Mother Nature, although they should work well with human beings, but they don't always. But what's been looked at more recently is this idea of integrating landscape management and gray and plant technology. And really this discussion has come a lot from the fire management discussion. And this report was an important one in 2014 because it reflected the conclusion that water treatment is not enough. We need to manage the landscape if we're going to reasonably say that we can provide safe water, especially in fire-prone landscapes, but also in other disturbance-prone landscapes, including flooding. It's a reasonable extrapolation to say, how bad is it? Because it's not, is it bad? It's how bad is it? How much more will we be challenged? And so some of these forest management challenges have included, I mentioned, this idea of fuel accumulation. It's not just changing climate. Here we've got the same forest in 1909 and 1948 and 1989. Our efforts at suppression of fire and conservation have actually contributed to increased fuel loads on the landscape. So it's a combination of what we've done with these practices. Fire's natural. And in some cases, for certain trees to germinate, they need fire, right? So we've actually led to these conditions and exacerbated them as well, not only through changing climate, but through our management activities. And so what we're talking about now, as far as our industry goes, is climate change adaptation that leverages and integrates infrastructure and in water treatment plants, and then these techno-ecological, nature-based solutions on the landscape. We say techno-ecological because nobody's going to provide a water supply without technology to gauge that the treatment process is working well. But these are fuel management techniques that have been studied at the watershed scale. There's 3 different combinations applied here, and the whole idea is, instead of traditional approaches where we put a fence around the system and there's conservation efforts and a fire can wipe it out, the idea here is to reduce fuels, to manage that risk, and to help the forests be more resilient and to bounce back more quickly, because it's not a question of will there be more fires, it's just when. It's not a question of will there be more floods, it's just when. And for people who think, oh, fire only comes around every 100 years or so in our region, we've seen fire come on top of fire. It's simply not the case, because the vegetation does bounce back quite quickly. And so that's where this Pan-Canadian network comes in, the forWater network. We actually have watershed research observatories across all the major forested landscapes of Canada. And one of the really cool things that we've seen is if we're extremely careful in how you go about implementing these technologies. Because you can imagine every disturbance leads to erosion, disturbs the landscape. But a student named Susan Baramian did some really great work to show that across these different types of land management approaches, we can actually control carbon. These here, they're not higher because of the disturbance necessarily. It's just really hard to get a good quote-unquote reference watershed. We never call them controls, because these are the types of activities that are going on those landscapes. And so one of the neatest things that we've seen, and this is where I'll close, is that for the first time globally in Alberta, in Calgary, a partnership between the city of Calgary and Spray Lake Sawmills and the forWater partnership led to the forest management plan, which includes values, objectives, indicators, and targets that really inform the implementation of these strategies on the landscape. Here we have an industrial forestry sector. For the first time, they actually specify that drinking water protection must be considered, should be considered. So their water quantity and quality were currently addressed, but not drinking water and drinking water treatability. And so in that plan, that's where we've got the statements about carbon and the impacts of disturbance. Of course, the devil's in the details, and now we have to figure out how to implement that. But this is still a big first nonetheless. And so in closing, what I guess I'd like to say is that for sure climate change threatens our water supplies. But if we can have many values for water: recreational, biodiversity, spiritual. But without safe drinking water, things get a little bit different, and treatability must be considered on these landscapes. And it's that integration of what's happening on the landscape and what's happening in the plant that we have to consider. And that means looking at some of these parameters like organic carbon, phosphorus, microbial communities that are not typically looked at as far as contamination goes. And we need to think about that integrated impact of what we build in plants and what happens on the landscape, and we need to develop concepts of resilience and integrated resilience into our operations. Otherwise, drinking water security will not be assured. Techno-ecological solutions, nature-based solutions, certainly offer hope, but they don't offer perfect control, and engineers don't like that. So we have to be judicious in how we go about implementing them, because once you do a harvesting approach on a landscape, it's not like you get a do-over, right? These are large-scale considerations. So hopefully there will be continued support for management of these types of source water protection resilience targets and treatment resilience targets in the future. I think that's where I'd like to close. I want to thank our partners, of which there are many, because you can't do this kind of work without multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral inputs, because nobody's trained in that way with all these areas, in all these areas. So thank you again. I would be very happy to answer any questions if anybody has them, or comments, or you can argue with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Emelko. Thank you for this excellent seminar. And now we do have time for questions. So if there are any questions from the audience, we'll start with the questions from the audience here, and then we'll go online. Yes, I think Subasis has her hand, and then Tommy.
Fascinating talk, Monica.
Thanks, Subasis.
Very, very complex topic, and you really framed it very well. I'm just curious if there is a reasonable amount of data on how treated water quality is impacted after these climatic events, fire, flood, or whatever. I think you showed one data set, the Blackburn
Yep.
paper, but was that just one location, or is that?
That was a bench scale study we did.
Okay.
So here's the problem. And I appreciate your question, so thank you so much. The question was, do we have treated water, and what happens in these systems? In many of these systems, they go to an alternate source because we live on a landscape that's rich in water. There's a fear of what are we going to do, right? So we don't have great stories. I mean, we've got the Fort McMurray story, and we saw what happened with treated water. I can tell you coagulant dosing in that system went from about 75 milligrams per liter of polyaluminum chloride to about 150. More challenges driven by carbon. But we have many systems that can go to alternate sources. And there's one step in between the disturbance and the treatment and then the treated water quality, and that's operator response. So the big confounding factor there is, what do the operators do? So I can tell you about a flood that occurred in Calgary not that long ago. And two plants, identical technologies in the same system, two different sources, but similar impacts on the rivers in the same system, in the same community. And the operators moved between the plants. One system really struggled during the disturbance, the other system flew through. The reason why there was a struggle was because the solids got backed up in the clarifier, and it was an issue of dosing. We don't have the telemetry, we don't have the sensors to tell us well enough how the carbon's changing, how to dose. And we need to do it in real time. An annual average from a model is useless. And it's a big deal to get a good monthly average in a model if it's a hydrological model, right? Here we're talking about within minutes fluctuations. So we need sensors, and we need to then help guide operational response. So there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of understanding, but those controls haven't been developed. So we'll be employed for a long time. I encourage you to join us.
Professor Fidon?
Yeah, I was wondering, so in the technologies, the control technologies you were talking about at the end, not sure I saw a lot of people are now talking about control fires. And how does that fit in that framework? Is control fires be managed? Does it have a role in this overall watershed management?
Thank you for your question. Indigenous communities long before us knew about the value of prescribed fire. And prescribed fire is very impactful. Prescribed fire, you start a fire, but you do it at the right time where you hope it won't spread. You understand the conditions. And the whole thing with prescribed fire is it's not as severe. So intensity is upward energy, fire severity is downward energy. And then you can also think about the percentage of the landscape that's impacted. So with the general thinking around prescribed fire is that it is less intense and less severe, and therefore the impacts aren't as dramatic, but you can still get that recovery of the natural ecology in the system. And you can choose where it is. The problem is they sometimes get out of control. So there have been big fires that started as prescribed fires. And so that's the danger always.
But it would potentially help.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I would definitely describe that as a great example of a techno-ecological nature-based solution.
So fantastic talk. I'm very curious about the paper you kind of quoted, the continental scale increase of phosphorus.
Mm-hmm.
Every time when they talk about that kind of scale, I always think about the source has to come from air.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I'm correct, but I'm just going to wonder, so did they identify the cause of the increase?
Well, it's total phosphorus, and the primary vector for phosphorus transport is particulate. And you tend to see these increases in areas of erosion where you have to have the sediments there to begin with. So you don't see these increases in landscapes that are largely, say, the superficial geology is volcanic, right? So the other thing is when you have airborne transport, the patterns are different. These with phosphorus, it's generally understood that it's runoff, and it's associated with storms, and you can see it go up and down when you have precipitation events. So they have. You can look at the hysteresis in the systems, and it's been relatively well described. So it's quite reasonable to think. It's quite reasonable to think that it's with the sediment and the runoff. Unlike other contaminants that certainly are transported through with airborne pathways, which include, of course, algae, where you can see similarities across at the continental scale, which is what we've seen in the forWater network, is that those communities there's striking similarities coast to coast.
Do we have more questions here before we go to the online questions? No? Carissa, do you have any questions online?
There's not.
Do you have any questions online? Okay, if there are no further questions. Yes, Professor Washal, did you say you had a question?
Yes, follow-up question. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on what these resilient technologies might look like.
I have my opinions. So what does resilience look like? I think that's a great question, because the first place I'd start is with what is resilience. I would go to ecological concepts of resistance and resilience. So resistance has to do with not changing even though you have a stressor, right? So a certain level of water quality in this case, even though there are stressors, our water treatment plant can maintain that quality. Resilience would be if there's an upset, how quickly can I bounce back? And I think in the treatment world, we tend to group both of those together as different types of resilience, but that's just lexicon. That's how it's evolved in the practical uses. And so we don't have quantitative matrix or frameworks to describe them. One of the biggest challenges with trying to describe resilience, I think, is how do you describe resilience if you have non-stationarity, where your conditions are always changing? So I think from a mathematical sense, that's very interesting, and we have to consider those challenges if we have a constantly changing system. How do we describe resilience? Maybe the changes in the system don't matter, and it's all about treated water performance, for example. So I think that there are those challenges, and then the other thing is there is a human component. There's a difference between an automated system and one that perhaps we might want to use artificial intelligence to drive, versus the human operator and how she or he or they respond to that. And so there's a lot of those elements that we have not worked through yet. So again, these are where the greatest opportunities lie, is really being honest with ourselves about what does resilience look like. The example I always come to is these package plants that are automated for these small communities, so if they don't have an operator. But what's that type of design? It's fail-safe, right? So those shut off if something's wrong, and then somebody has to go look at it. That's not resilient, that's fail-safe, right? And so how long are people willing to go without a supply of water, right? So we have to decide from a philosophical perspective in design, are we going to continue to move in a direction? Because that's where we have been moving, is we've been moving towards fail-safe. Artificial intelligence approaches offer us an alternative, for sure. The problem is that we don't have the sensors that we need, right? Zeta potential analysis that many of you do here is a great example of that. It gives us an average value, but you can have many distributions that lead to that average value. And it's the extremes we're interested in, not the averages, right? We care about the average, but we need to understand the extremes. And so that's where those opportunities lie for us. So, but I think resilience isn't going to go away. And the more we push ahead with these characterization tools that are being developed in places like here, and ability to test theories about processes at the fundamental scale, that's where we're going to push ourselves ahead. So many things are going on. We need to find the big drivers. That's engineering, right? 80% of the way for 20% of the effort. Let's get the big drivers first, and then let's keep refining and getting better. But we have to find those big drivers.
Yes, just one last question.
One last question, sorry.
No pressure, Camila.
Have you or your team looked at potentially using like remote sensing as a tool to monitor?
Absolutely. So me, no. People I know, yes. Remote sensing is a fantastic tool for gauging large-scale landscape change and of course then identifying if something is brewing. And there's a lot of great work done globally on remote sensing of disturbances, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. I had intended to bring that up. And that is an area that I think is just ripe for success. Because if we can deal with the problem, maybe we don't have to. We have some time to develop the in-plant solutions.